For more than 100 years, the common story has been that Butch Cassidy died in Bolivia in 1908. But later investigations and DNA testing complicated that picture, because remains linked to the Bolivia story didn't match Cassidy's family. That doesn't automatically prove he survived, but it does mean the case isn't as closed as people think. That's why the spotlight shifted back to Utah, his home state, where researchers have tried to test suspected burial leads and bone samples connected to long-running local claims. The headline version is simple. If Cassidy really made it back, he could have lived into the early 1940s, reaching 77. Now, let's break down what the DNA can actually support and what's still speculation. Number 1. The real person behind the legend. Butch Cassidy wasn't a movie character first. He was a real guy, born as Robert LeRoy Parker on April 13, 1866 in Utah Territory, and he grew up around ranch country near Circleville. In other words, he came up as a cowboy before he ever became an outlaw. That matters because the skills people later described, handling horses, reading the land, staying calm under pressure, were normal working skills on the Old West frontier long before they were outlaw skills. He also came from a big Mormon family, and by the time he was a teenager, he had already learned what it meant to work hard, keep moving, and rely on your reputation. The Butch part of the name wasn't some dramatic title. It came from a short stretch of time working around a butcher shop, and the Cassidy part was taken from an older cattle thief named Mike Cassidy, who influenced him when Parker was still young and impressionable. From there, the record gets clearer. By the 1890s, Parker had moved from petty theft into bigger robberies. He even served time in the Wyoming Territorial Prison for horse theft and got out in 1896, which is the kind of detail you don't get in legend. You get it in paperwork. When the name Butch Cassidy shows up in serious Old West history, it's tied to a specific type of crime. Organized, planned robberies of banks and trains, usually with a focus on getting away clean rather than turning it into a massacre. Even hostile sources tended to describe him as careful and strategic. That's part of why the legend stuck. In the Wild West, plenty of men stole cattle or held up a stagecoach. What made Cassidy stand out was the scale, the planning, and the fact that he was linked to a crew that newspapers and detectives grouped together as the Wild Bunch. They used remote hideouts and backcountry routes, places hard for lawmen to reach quickly, so a robbery could be over long before a posse even got organized. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Old West wasn't just empty space. It was towns, mining camps, railroads, federal marshals, private detectives, and local lawmen, all trying to control a fast-growing economy. A payroll shipment from a mine could mean months of wages. A train express car could carry cash for whole regions. So when outlaws hit those targets, the response wasn't just one sheriff getting mad. It could involve rail companies, territorial officials, posses, and agencies like the Pinkertons, who basically operated as the private intelligence arm of big business. That kind of pressure is what pushed Cassidy and his closest partner, Harry Longabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid, out of the United States and into South America. And it's also what created the conditions for a perfect mystery later. A famous outlaw, multiple aliases, long-distance travel, and law enforcement that wanted the case to be over. Number 2. The official Bolivia ending. The accepted story is straightforward on paper. By 1901, Cassidy and the Sundance Kid left the U.S. and headed to South America, living under assumed names for at least part of that time. In early November 1908, two English-speaking bandits robbed a mining company payroll courier in southern Bolivia. A few days later, Bolivian authorities tracked suspects to the village of San Vicente. Shots were exchanged, and by the next morning, 2 foreign men were found dead inside the building where they had taken cover. From there, the story locks in. Those 2 men were said to be Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and they were buried quickly in a local cemetery, often described as an unmarked grave or a burial area outside the main town. A lot of retellings add a very specific detail. After the shooting outside, the local mayor reported hearing screams from inside the house, and then 2 final gunshots. That detail matters because it's often used to explain how 2 men could end up dead without a long cinematic firefight. Some versions suggest one man was badly wounded, and the other ended it, then turned the gun on himself. Whether that's exactly what happened or not, the bigger point is that the official version depends heavily on local reports, not on a clean identification process. Here's where the problem starts. The identification was always indirect. The people on the ground in Bolivia didn't have a way to do a modern ID. There were descriptions, rumors, and the fact that Cassidy and Sundance were known to be in the region. Pinkerton detectives had warned banks and companies in South America to watch for them, which shows that the duo were on people's radar. But no one who personally knew Cassidy or Longabaugh walked in and said, "That's them," and there were no widely circulated photographs of the bodies that could be checked later. That gap is small in the moment, because news travels and a story becomes official fast. But it's huge decades later, because the whole case depends on assumptions. 2 American bandits died in Bolivia right when Cassidy and Sundance were wanted, so people connected the dots. It's not an unreasonable conclusion, but it's not the same as proof. And in a time when communication was slow and records were inconsistent, a mistaken identity was completely possible. Number 3. Why rumors of survival never died. Once you see the weak spots, the rumors make more sense. The first weak spot is the lack of a positive ID. The second is how quickly a legend can run ahead of evidence. Cassidy and Sundance were already famous outlaws. A dramatic ending in a shootout on the other side of the world fits the kind of story people repeat. It also fits what lawmen and agencies wanted: a closed case. If the outlaws were dead, the chase was over. Then there's the family factor. Cassidy's own relatives later said, in different ways, that the Bolivia story didn't match what they believed. The most famous claim comes from his sister, Lula Parker Bettinson, who wrote that he returned to the family ranch area in Utah for a visit in 1925. In her version, the idea is that someone helped plant the Bolivia story so he could stop being hunted, and after that, he lived quietly under another name. That's a powerful claim because it's personal, and it comes from inside the Parker family. But family stories can be tricky. Sometimes they preserve details outsiders don't have. Sometimes they mix memory, loyalty, and wishful thinking. What makes the Cassidy case messy is that even within the family, the timeline and the details shift in different retellings. Some accounts place him dying in the late 1930s. Other accounts push the date later. That doesn't automatically mean it's fake. It means the story evolved the way oral history often does. At the same time, there's a pattern in Old West history where people want a famous outlaw to have made it out. Billy the Kid has that kind of mythology. Jesse James has that kind of mythology. Cassidy fits right into it because he had a public image that was oddly sympathetic, clever, smiling, more likely to threaten than to kill. So when people hear the bodies were never confirmed, their next thought is, okay, so maybe he slipped away again. And that's where impersonators and competing identities show up. For years, some people believed a man named William T. Phillips was the real Cassidy.
partly because he wrote a manuscript about the Wild Bunch called Bandit Invincible and seemed to know details. Other researchers argue Phillips was an imposter who may have crossed paths with the gang but wasn't Cassidy. Either way, the fact that this debate exists shows how easy it is for a mystery to keep feeding itself. No confirmed body, a famous name, and a steady supply of men who could plausibly say, "That was me." Now add one more ingredient. The Old West was full of reinvention. People changed names, moved states, and restarted their lives. If an outlaw did survive and come back, blending in wasn't impossible, especially if the public assumed he was dead. There was no social media, no easy photo comparison, and no nationwide database that a rural lawman could search in seconds. If you were careful, you could disappear into regular work and keep your mouth shut. Cassidy, of all people, had the personality and the discipline to try. Number 4. What DNA testing actually changed. For a long time, the debate was mostly paper trails versus stories. Then forensic science entered the chat. In 1991, a team that included the forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow went to San Vicente to locate and exhume remains believed to be connected to the 1908 deaths. Snow wasn't a random hobbyist. He was known for using bones and hard science to solve identity questions, including famous high-stakes cases. The idea was to do the same thing here: rebuild identity from remains using modern methods, and if possible, use DNA to compare the remains to living relatives of Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
This kind of work isn't just dig and test. Forensic anthropology looks at age-at-death estimates, skeletal traits, injuries, and dental patterns. If you have enough material, you can even estimate stature and compare it to known descriptions. DNA adds a second layer, but it doesn't replace the first layer. It's supposed to confirm what the bones already suggest. The results were a shock to anyone expecting a neat ending. After forensic work and DNA comparison, the remains they recovered did not match the relatives. In other words, the skeleton they tested was not Butch Cassidy and not the Sundance Kid. Researchers suggested that what they had actually found could have been someone else entirely, possibly a German miner named Gustav Zimmer, who was known to have been in the area. This is where a lot of people jump too fast. No match does not equal they survived. It can also mean wrong grave. Cemeteries change, markers move, memories fade, and in a small village cemetery from the early 1900s, it's easy to dig in the wrong spot. So the DNA result didn't prove survival. What it did do is remove the feeling of certainty around the Bolivia ending. If the most famous forensic search came up with a non-match, then the question stays open. Were the outlaws buried somewhere else in San Vicente? Or was the original story wrong about who died in that house? There's also a bigger lesson here about DNA. DNA is powerful, but only when the sample is good enough and the comparison is well set up. Old remains can be contaminated, mixed, or too degraded to get a full profile. And even when you get results, you have to interpret them carefully. In this case, the clean takeaway is that one official grave candidate in Bolivia did not belong to Cassidy or Longabaugh. After that, everything else is about probabilities, not certainty. Number 5. The Utah connection in the DNA era.
Utah is the center of gravity in this story for one simple reason. It's where Robert LeRoy Parker came from, and it's where the Parker family line is rooted. That matters because modern DNA comparisons need reference points, living relatives who can provide a genetic baseline. When researchers say they compared a sample to the relatives of Cassidy,
They're talking about building a family profile first. Without that, DNA is just raw code with no match list. And it's one reason the Cassidy case is still a live question. The family line is large enough that reference DNA exists, but the locations and identities of the right remains are not settled. Utah is also where several "here's where he really ended up" stories keep resurfacing. One of the most common is the idea that Cassidy returned and was buried secretly on or near the old family property around Circleville. A TV investigation decades later even went looking in that area and reported finding small human bone fragments. The lab result that got attention was basic but important. The fragments were human. The less exciting part is the part people skip. There wasn't enough usable DNA to build a reliable profile and prove identity. That's a normal problem in forensic work, especially with tiny fragments, uncertain burial conditions, and decades of weather and soil chemistry working against the sample. So when you hear DNA evidence from Utah, it often doesn't mean we proved it was Butch Cassidy. More often it means people tried to test a Utah-based claim, and DNA either ruled something out or it couldn't deliver a clear answer. That's still valuable because it turns folklore into testable questions. Utah also shows up in the Sundance side of the mystery. There have been claims that the Sundance Kid lived under another name in Utah and died decades later, and those claims have also been tested with exhumations and DNA comparisons.
Those tests, from what has been reported publicly, did not confirm that the remains belonged to Longabaugh. Even though that's a different person, it's the same pattern. Strong local stories, real digging, real science, and then results that either rule out a candidate or leave the case unresolved. Number 6. Where the "lived to 77" story comes from. Now we get to the specific claim that keeps popping up. The idea that Cassidy didn't die in 1908 and instead lived into the 1940s, sometimes framed as "he lived to 77." The age part is easy to check. If Robert LeRoy Parker was born in April 1866, then he would have turned 77 in April 1943. So any story placing his death after that date lines up with 77. A story placing his death earlier in 1943 would make him 76. One detailed version of a later-life Cassidy story was published by Deseret News in 2001. The article describes how a man showed up at the home of Matt Warner's family in Utah in 1939 and, after a tense conversation, claimed to be Butch Cassidy. According to the story, he asked about old names and old events, reacted strongly to a photograph, and then talked through memories connected to robberies and escape routes. Supporters take that as the kind of detail a random stranger wouldn't know. Skeptics point out the obvious. By 1939, Cassidy's story was already famous enough that a clever imposter could study it and perform it. The same article adds another layer: letters. The Warner family reportedly kept handwritten letters from a man using a different name, and a researcher named Steve Lacey argued those letters backed up the identity claim. Lacey also argued that Cassidy used multiple aliases after returning to the United States, and that one trail leads to a death on March 16, 1943, in Tonopah, Nevada, under the name Frank McMullen, after an extended hospital stay, followed by burial in the Tonopah City Cemetery. It's important to treat this for what it is: a claim built from testimony, letters, and identity arguments, not a proven DNA identification. But it matters because it shows how the 1943 date got into circulation. It didn't come out of nowhere. It shows up as part of a specific chain of people, documents, and retellings. And once a story like that exists, it starts merging with other ideas.
People who already believe he came home after Bolivia look for a later death record that fits the math. If you think he survived, a 1943 death date feels plausible because it gives him a full, hidden lifetime, long enough for him to be old, quiet, and mostly forgotten. It also places him in the same general era when some surviving Old West figures really were passing away, and when newspapers loved Last of the Outlaws stories. Number 7. Why mitochondrial DNA is not a name tag. A lot of modern DNA proves it talk collapses different types of DNA into one idea. In reality, different DNA tests answer different questions. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is inherited through the maternal line. It's useful because it survives in old remains more often than other DNA, and it can tell you whether someone belongs to a particular maternal family line. But mtDNA usually cannot tell you exactly which person someone was. If two brothers share the same mother, they have the same mtDNA. If multiple relatives come down the same maternal line, they can match too. So mtDNA can strongly support this person is from that family line, but it rarely pins down one individual by name. Autosomal DNA, the kind used by consumer ancestry tests, can sometimes get closer to a specific identity, especially with enough relatives and good samples, but that's harder to obtain from old bones. Y-DNA, which follows the direct paternal line, can be powerful for male line questions, but only if you have solid reference samples from the same paternal line and a good enough sample from the remains.
On top of that, the process matters as much as the biology. To treat a result as strong evidence, you want a clean chain of custody, careful contamination control, and, ideally, independent lab work that reaches the same conclusion. You also want a realistic alternative explanation. If the DNA shows Parker family line, the key question becomes, which Parker? In a place like Utah, with big families and repeated first names, that's not a small question. A strong claim isn't, the DNA matched the Parkers. A strong claim is, the DNA matched the Parkers and the timeline, documents, and alternative identities don't make sense for anyone else. That's also why statistics get misused. A DNA match can be rare and still not be unique to one person if the match points to a family line rather than to an individual. So if you hear a claim like, DNA from a Utah grave proves Butch Cassidy lived to 77, the first follow-up is simple. What type of DNA? What relatives were used for comparison? And what other Parker family candidates could fit the same result? Without those details, it's not science, it's marketing. Number 8. What would count as real proof? If someone truly wanted to settle the question, the roadmap is clear, even if it's difficult. First, you'd need a credible target, a specific grave or set of remains linked to a documented identity trail, not just a rumor. Second, you'd need strong reference DNA from known Parker relatives, and ideally from multiple lines so you can narrow down the match rather than just saying related. Third, you'd want the testing done in a way that outside experts can evaluate. Methods explained, results published, and key claims replicated. At the same time, you'd still need the history side. DNA doesn't tell you outlaw or lawman. It doesn't tell you whether someone robbed a bank, rode with the Wild Bunch, or faked a death. It only tells you biological relationships.
To connect DNA to the Butch Cassidy identity, you still need the timeline. Where the person lived, what names they used,
and whether those records make sense compared to what we already know from the Pinkerton chase and the South American chapter. A real investigation also doesn't rely on just one kind of evidence. Forensics can help in other ways, too. Stable isotope testing, for example, can sometimes hint at where a person lived based on chemistry locked into teeth and bones, though it's not a magic GPS, and it needs careful interpretation. Even basic forensic details like age at death can be a reality check. If a skeleton looks like a man in his 20s, it can't be Cassidy in the 1940s. If it looks like an older man, that doesn't prove it's him, but it can keep you from chasing the wrong story. Right now, the strongest science-based point in the whole debate is actually negative. The best-known exhumation and DNA effort in Bolivia did not match Cassidy or Longabaugh, which keeps the door open. Then you have a stack of later life claims, family stories like the 1925 Utah visit, identity claims tied to letters, and the 1943 death claim, each one interesting, each one incomplete. That's why the mystery survives. The Old West had outlaws and lawmen, but it also had paperwork gaps, deliberate reinvention, and a public that loved a good story. And those three things together can keep one question alive for more than a century.